Are you okay? So you're okay with your image there?
We're good? The audio is good?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not too loud?
The visuals are superb.
Yes.
So, okay, maybe just say your name and spell it for Dave since when he needs to put in footnotes.
Sure, I'm David Moore, that's M-O-R-E, and I'm a retired medical lab manager with 30 years in at Kingston General. And along the way, I developed my love of history, which I'd had since I was a kid, and my love of boats and sailing, and they have all come together in writing historical novels about the Kingston region. And I went back to school and to do a doctorate in history that largely involves early colonial Canadians, Canadiens in fact, working bateaus and sailing vessels on the upper St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. So I met Mary doing a James Walk tour, well, before that, but she approached me in the James Walk tour, and we developed this vision together to start up a program to celebrate Canada's maritime history, going back into Indigenous times, and starting with a birch bark canoe. And Mary did all of the grunt work very, very successfully to make this go. And so last summer they built a birch bark canoe and celebrated it right in the middle of COVID and everything else. So she's been wonderful to work with, and I've very much enjoyed it.
Well, that's an accolade. Okay. So maybe we'll just talk about, like we're thinking maybe we might even make 3 short 20-minute films about, one about the build, one about the, what was I going to say? One of them is I can't remember what the second one, the build, and about the history, and about the importance of the canoe in Canadian history, and the third about reconciliation. So maybe we'll start with the importance of the canoe in Canadian history. If you can, all of the various explorers and the, ins and outs of them working with Indigenous people.
Oh, for sure. And the birch bark canoe and other types of canoes too. But in our region, going out to the Rockies, from here to the Rockies, the birch bark canoe, and going down to the Maritimes as well. The birch bark canoe was fundamental to cultures right across the country long before Europeans got here. And it's a marvelously sophisticated use of materials they had. And of course, once the Europeans got here, the foundation of European existence in what's now Canada was the fur trade, and the fur trade route from European towns like Montreal to the west was up the Ottawa River and across various other rivers to Lake Huron. And the birch bark canoe was the only way to traverse that territory, full of very hilly, full of portages around waterfalls, and the canoes were light and strong, and eventually during the sort of what you might call the high voyageur time in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the canots de maître were 30, 40 feet long, carrying tons and tons of cargo, trade goods going up, and furs coming back, peltry coming back. So, right to the end of the fur trade, in around 1830s or so, the birch bark canoe was a fundamental thing that bound Canada together and also connected it to Europe at the same time.
So what about the interactions between Indigenous people and the settlers? But they weren't settlers at this point, kind of, explorers or map makers or whatever like that.
No, it's true. The birch bark canoe facilitated that. The early European population in Canada was French, and they had a very different approach to exploiting the continent than the British settlers in what became the 13 colonies to the south, in the sense that the French were ended up much less interested and almost zero interest in actually possessing the land and thereby dispossessing Indigenous people who lived on it and essentially owned it. They were very interested in developing trading partnerships. And so there was very much in many ways, relation of equal to equal during that early fur trade period. And I have to say that was not unique to the French. One of the legacies we have in Canadian history is the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is a part of which is enshrined in our Constitution today, dealing with Indigenous rights. And so the British at the time at least acted as well as though they were dealing with Indigenous peoples and nations on an equal to equal basis. And this lasted quite a long time. There was always some friction. There's always, we're all human beings, and but there was neither side was able to dominate the other, either through numbers or really either through numbers or technology at the time. The Indigenous folks adopted some Western European technology, but it never totally supplanted their own, and even in the early 1800s, by the War of 1812 and that sort of thing, the Indigenous warriors would go to war with European muskets, black powder muskets, but they would carry bows and arrows, and when they ran out of gunpowder or they were otherwise obliged to not use the muskets, they were quite happy to resort to using arrows again. And on the other side, on the sort of more domestic side, we have had always this idea that Western technologies were so superior to what the Indigenous folks had developed. You know, and there's a wonderful paper about sort of an archaeology paper about a brass kettle, copper kettle, that had been traded to, I think it's a Mi'kmaq family in New Brunswick or in the Gaspé, anyway, eastern Canada, and it had been ceremonially buried with a member of the family. And when it was discovered and unearthed, they realized after they'd really stripped it of all of its Indigenous meaning, it had been wrapped up very carefully, and much of the wrappings had rotted to some extent. But when they analyzed what they'd removed, and of course it sat for a while in a museum, a cultural museum in Quebec, but it had all been polished back to its original state coming from Europe, and all the sort of history that it had experienced once it got here was almost erased. But they figured out that this was sort of used as a ceremonial and presentation item. It wasn't used for everyday cooking. They continued on using their traditional method of cooking with clay bowls and birch bark vessels and that sort of thing, using their own technology. But this sort of sat on the mantle, if you will, and was brought out for special occasions, including burial with the family. And it was one of the things that keyed my interest, my sort of second interest, apart from maritime history, Canadian maritime history, was Indigenous history when I started into my master's and PhD. And what I began to realize over years was that people kind of criticize the Indigenous folks for being Stone Age and not having all of these metallurgical tools and technology that the Europeans brought with them. But it turns out there's a very practical reason for that. The way Europeans learned to smelt metal was they probably accidentally combined tin and copper together at some point in the Middle East and produced bronze. And that's where you got the Bronze Age. Before that, we were Stone Age ourselves. And so the Bronze Age then ushered in, of course, with humans being curious, led to the Iron Age. But if you didn't have the Bronze Age as a step, you never got to the Iron Age. And there's a reason why the Bronze Age never occurred in North America, is because there's no tin. And to this day, nobody's ever found a tin deposit. So without tin, you couldn't have metallurgical development in the same sense it happened in Europe. And so I began to think about that, and I began to think about a 10,000-year-old civilization with, more or less continuous handing down of knowledge orally and symbolically through what we realized were wampum belts that had symbolic meaning, and that there were people trained among the Indigenous folks who were trained to remember the history based on the wampum belts as cues, as memory cues. But I began to think about that, and I realized that one of the most valuable things that we have almost lost, but perhaps we can hope we haven't, is that 10,000 or much longer, it could be 40,000 years of direct connection with nature. What metallurgy did for the Europeans is it allowed them to dominate nature. They didn't have to live with nature. We didn't have to live with nature anymore. We had steel axes, instead of stone axes, which meant that we could take forests down, and we did. And so where we learned to dominate, they learned to live with. And so I began to think about, what does that mean? 12,000 years, for the sake of argument, of living with nature and learning directly from nature, because that's how they developed birch bark canoes, as they learned that spruce roots could be split and used to tie the canoe together, and cedar could be split and used for the frame and the planking of the canoe, and birch bark could be used to this is an incredibly sophisticated understanding of the materials of the natural world, because they didn't have saws and tools to allow them to dominate it. And this is an incredibly important issue today. The natural world is still there, although we're beating it to shreds. And it will recover if we can let it. And it's one of those fundamental cultural differences between European culture, for the sake of argument, and Indigenous cultures here, is that they believe fundamentally that they're a part of nature, that they are equal to the trees and equal to the animals and the fish and the birds. Whereas we were taught for thousands of years of Christianity, that God gave us the world to dominate, gave us dominion over the world. So these are fundamentally different cultural approaches to how to live. And I think now we'd better be listening to the forest and the animals of the forest and essentially the universe around us, or we are going to destroy our home. And they can teach us. The Indigenous folks can teach us. We've tried to ruin it for them by degrading and disrespecting their cultures. But the more you think about it, they learned things in 12,000 years of dealing directly with nature that we have forgotten for 10,000 years. And I think that's important knowledge.
Wow.
That's one of my rants.
No, that's wonderful. Okay. So I'm wondering relationships between, in the early days, because it's so sad in a sense that there was this, trading relationship that worked for both sides, and then we move into the loyalists coming, and that was really the beginning of the domination thing that was so hard for everybody. But before that, again, like someone like David Thompson, who married a 14-year-old Mohawk woman and was sort of faithful to her forever. I mean, these kinds of relationships, and I mean, I don't know if you know anything about it, but there doesn't seem to be anything about sexuality back in those days at all. Like, in their accounts, like in Radisson's diary, for example. I mean, so except, and I'm wondering about, like, have you read The Bushrunner?
I haven't read it yet,
Yeah,
no.
because it's really a fun book. But, when the voyageurs went out into the Indigenous communities, what was that experience like for them mostly, from what you've read? Because I haven't read very much about it.
Oh, I think there's one perfect example of what it was like for the voyageurs. They loved it. And one example that was from very early on in New France in the late 1600s, Louis XIV decreed against letting the young men to go and play in the forest rather than farm, you understand, because the colonial authorities wanted farming to be done along the shores of the St. Lawrence River. But there was some money to be made in the fur trade, and the decrees against it were so harsh that they had to get permission from the governor, who would allow a dozen or 25 licenses for men to go off into the upper country, the Pays d'en Haut, to trade with the indigenous peoples. And if you went off there as a coureur de bois, which was an illegal fur trader, and got caught, there was lashes, you were flogged, and the final penalty was that you were exiled to be an oarman on a French galley in the Mediterranean. Chained to a galley, you became a slave if you were caught a third time trading with the Indians without a license. And yet and the reason for this is because hundreds of young men out of a colony that was very small to begin with, by the turn of the 1700s, the colony was only a few thousand people, and hundreds of their young men went off to the forest, didn't come back for 6 months, stayed all summer, and some of them would stay for years, of course, wintering with the indigenous folks and having families. And they fell in love with indigenous women and raised families, and that's where the people we know as Métis came from originally, from a very old, perfectly normal, natural human relationships. And the Hudson's Bay Company traders were the same. There's a good book called Many Tender Ties that was written some time ago now, probably 20, 30 years ago now. But it talked about the relationships of the Hudson's Bay Company traders with Indigenous women and how these were very strong relationships. But one of the ones that I know about in particular, because the man and the woman involved became a hero and heroine in my novels, was the one between Molly Brant and William Johnson. And we all know the name of Molly Brant. Some of us only know it because she was the sister of Joseph Brant, and whose name you don't want to mention if you go down to Caledonia. But he was a great loyal warrior on the side of the British during the American Revolution, and which is why the Grand River tract was awarded as in gratitude by Governor Haldeman at the end of the war. But his sister Molly married a man named William Johnson. And William Johnson's son John was put in charge of settling the Loyalists in Kingston and around Lake Ontario at the end of the war when they were refugees. And they had a relationship. They were married Indian fashion, not formally in a European style, but she became the chatelaine, as it were, of his manor house in upper New York State, west of Albany, up the Mohawk River, on the Mohawk River Valley. And she was Mohawk. She was her mother was a famous herbalist, and she became a famous herbalist in her own right. But as the wife of Sir William Johnson, who became the British Crown's Indian Affairs representative in North America, she was probably for 20 or 30 years during their marriage the most powerful woman in North America. She had, on the Indigenous side, during the American Revolution, Molly was a warrior leader in the sense of she was the one who disciplined the warriors when the British went to her to ask her to get them in line when they were doing something or other, which wasn't unusual, that the British didn't particularly like. And Molly, there's several wonderful quotes about Molly being the boss of all of these Indigenous warriors, these big men. One of the things that struck me the most was that this positive partnership, and he met her because he had become essentially deep friends with her uncle, whose British name was Hendrick. Hendrick was a Mohawk warrior chief, war chief, and he and William Johnson became good friends and developed a relationship that allowed William Johnson to ascend rapidly in the political order of the colony of New York, and allowed the Mohawks, through William's patronage and support, to dominate the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for many, many years, even though they were diminishing in numbers. This partnership dominated the middle of the 18th century, middle 1700s in New York and far beyond. But the interesting thing about the relationship between William Johnson and Molly Brant was that, of course, he died at the beginning, just before the American Revolution broke out. And after he died, Molly and most of the Mohawks were driven out from their homes along the Mohawk River and became refugees at Fort Niagara under the British, and went to war with the Americans. After the war, the first Lieutenant Governor of Ontario was named Simcoe. Lake Simcoe, of course, and Simcoe Island in Kingston is named for him. And his wife, Lady Simcoe, was Elizabeth Simcoe, was a diarist and a very articulate woman, and she has published a diary that everyone should read, Lady Simcoe's Diary, that's available, online or in libraries and just about anywhere. And in that diary, she describes a meeting between herself and Molly Brant here in Kingston after the war had finished. And she was stuck there because her husband, the governor, was sick. The lieutenant governor was sick with what turned out to be likely pleurisy, which killed people in those days. And it was it's a terribly painful disease. You can hardly breathe and without gasping. It's like having broken ribs all the time. Anyway, so her husband got pleurisy, it seems, and for a month he was suffering in Kingston, stuck there. There was no doctor except for a so-called horse doctor, no European doctor. And eventually, Lady Simcoe heard of Molly, and she came along and prescribed what it seems to be as calamine powder, made him sniff calamine, crushed calamine, which cured him in a day or 2 days. And they chatted and had tea together while he recovered. And they were talking about the good old days, of course, that came up before the American Revolution. And there was one passage in her diary that I'm paraphrasing now, but it went something like, every time William Johnson's name came up, and this is 20 years after he had died, every time his name came up, Molly's eyes would fill with tears. And I remember thinking of that, and I said, well, now that's a love story. And I said, gee, I've been married for over 40 years, and I bet 20 years after I'm gone, when my name comes up, my wife's eyes won't fill with tears. And it struck me that this was we hear about Pocahontas and John Smith, and that's basically a made-up story. There's mythology about that was made up. But this one between William Johnson and Molly Brant is absolutely real, and it's our story, and we know nothing about it. So that provoked me into looking into this complicated period of our history, and I realized that in those days it was a partnership. There was equality between the Indigenous folks, equality of power in a very real sense. And that meant there was equality of relationship. You couldn't go out into the forest and expect to come back with fur unless you were willing to deal. And to deal, you had to be fair, because if you got a reputation for stealing from Indigenous folks, there were certain repercussions in the forest for white folks who did that, just as there are today. And it began to change, of course, when the huge immigration of the late 1700s and 1800s, the 19th century, put an end to all that, because the numbers were just staggering. And on the American side, without criticizing them, we differ from them in degree, I think, to some extent qualitatively, but when you look at it closely, there are some real differences. But in fact, Thomas Jefferson was determined to push west during the American Revolution, and the indigenous folks could move or die. And he wrote that, or words to that effect. And it was different here, partly because of the French influence. They didn't want the land, they wanted the furs. And to get the furs, they had to deal with the indigenous folks as equals, more or less. And that has continued on a very different strand of history from the Americans. Where they walked west, we went west in canoes. We were waterborne going west. You could not walk across, the Canadian Shield around Lake Superior. It just, you couldn't do it. And the Indian folks, the indigenous folks didn't do it either. They used canoes. So our western push was waterborne. It was based on trade, on a certain degree of equality, on maintaining positive relations with the indigenous folks. The Brits were pretty pragmatic about that. They realized that if they kept positive relations, the indigenous nations were allies against the Americans. And the Brits betrayed them again and again and again. It's a very tiresome story from that point of view if you're European descent. The number of betrayals anyway, that's part of the tragedy that we face now, that we've inherited, is that after Confederation came in the middle of that, came in the middle of this incredible European migration, and stop me if I'm rambling on too much, but one of the striking things that I think now also rings a bell with me is that one of the experiences Hendrick had, who was Molly Brant's uncle and best friends of William Johnson, he was in England. He was sent to England very early in the 1700s and went to court, was celebrated at court with Queen Anne. And she gave him and several other chiefs that were selected, I'm not sure how, but they were picked by the British to go over and represent the indigenous people at court, more as curiosities, I'm sure, than anything else. But Queen Anne gave a set of silver communion vessels to Hendrick and the other chiefs that they brought back in 1713 or 1715. And some of them now sit at Tandanaga in the Mohawk Church there, and some of them are off at Grand River. So this was a recognized partnership in the 1700s. And it went sour south of what is now the international border much faster than it did up here. But the burden that we have as Canadians today, I think, is that it also went sour here. And it went sour through our actions, not through the actions of the Indigenous folks in Canada. And that's where reconciliation has to account for that, I think. We're accountable for essentially extorting all their land from them. I don't think anybody today would call any of those land deals signed, the numbered treaties that were signed in the 19th century and before. I don't think any lawyer today would say they would pass legal muster. The one that affects Kingston, the Crawford Purchase, so-called, was done on Carleton Island, where the British had a big military base in 1784. And they sent Major or Captain Crawford, I can't remember, of one of the British regular regiments to Carleton Island and told him to secure a purchase of the land around Kingston so the Loyalists could settle here. And the Brits were at that time at least that respectful that they knew at least there was a fig leaf over the idea that they had to own the land and somebody else owned it at the time. So the Crawford Purchase, it's like the Manhattan Purchase for some hats and coats and, some gunpowder each year and an annual annuity of these things. The local Mississauga Ojibwe sachems signed over the detail. Well, they were sitting on an island, on Carleton Island, with probably at the time nearly 1,000 British troops. And no doubt Crawford negotiated with a platoon of redcoats behind him, armed and bayoneted, and these poor Mississauga Ojibwe were sitting there confronting the might of the British Empire. And there is actually questions on record. I think some of these sachems were asked after the fact, well, how could you give away all that territory? And there's dispute, of course, exactly how much they did give in return for such a small amount. And the record suggests that this Ojibwe sachem kind of shrugged and he said, well, at least we're getting something this way. We know if we say no, you're just going to take it anyway. And of course, that is what happened in the States. And here, anybody, I think, I'm not a lawyer, but anyone today would call that extortion. So, and that's the pattern right across the country. In Canada, yes, it was peaceful, or more peaceful at least, but the underlying knowledge was, well, we're going to take it anyway, so here's what you get. And that is something that, years and years. And I was lucky at high school to have some really good history teachers because they were few and far between. But none of this. I was embarrassed to understand that I didn't know who Molly Brant was. She's fundamental to, and Joseph Brant, they were both fundamental to the creation of Canada. And that went even farther into our British-speaking, English-speaking relationships with the French of New France and their descendants in Canada. And these things are very complicated. I'm very proud in many ways of the fact that Canada has and continues to evolve so that we still have dialogues among the 200 or 250 Indigenous nations and our nation and the Crown, as well as French Canadians with the majority of the country. These are still dialogues, live dialogues, and uncomfortable dialogues, but they're happening here. They're not happening in the United States. There's no dialogue going on really I think, at that kind of level to the same extent, although there is some dialogue. So I have to give credit to Canada and Sir John A.'s Canada, for that matter. He was a person of his time, and the time was racist. The culture, the European culture here was racist, without any doubt at all. And what we thought was a good thing for the Indians to assimilate them and destroy their culture was perfectly acceptable at the time. And almost everybody felt that it was the right thing to do, which is why we never heard anything about it until, the mid-90s. And all of a sudden, we're hearing Indigenous voices telling us, well, here, put yourself in our shoes. And one of the things that struck me, particularly about the residential schools, was that we know that there were at least 6,000 kids who were forced to go to the residential schools and didn't come home, who died there of TB, basically. preventable disease. They knew how to prevent TB by that time, but they refused to do it in the residential schools. They refused to clean them. This is all on record. One of the docs that they hired, I guess around 1910, to be nominally the supervisor of medicine for the under the Indian Act, he wrote a scathing report which was suppressed. And one of his fellow administrators at the time said, "I think we are bordering on negligent homicide as a government." And that was what they said in 1910. So there's real culpability, conscious culpability, conscious effort to doom this culture, this 12,000-year-old culture that, you know, basically talked to the trees and their the buffalo. And I'm not a hunter per se, although my dad owned a farm near Cornwall for a while, and I was the guy. He was a guy who was on his rifle team as a kid, and nearly went to Bisley as a marksman for his high school. This was a popular thing in high school of the day. And even when I was growing up at KCVI, they had a Army Cadet rifle team that I was on. Anyway, so I was the guy who went out with the .22 and shot the groundhogs to keep them out of the garden. And I wasn't there to exterminate them. I just wanted to, you know, every few years you had to move them back a couple of 100 yards from the garden. And that was really the only way to do it. And I remember one day I shot one, but I just winged it. And it was standing up in the grass like a gopher, like they do, and I winged it. And it dropped down into the hay, and it ran right up to my feet and stopped at my feet and looked up at me as if to say, and the way I interpreted it was, "You dumbass, why don't you do the job right?" I know I've talked to a longtime hunter that's a friend of mine that you know, I think, as well, Robert, anyway, it'll come to me, who is a hunter. And he said, it was probably saying, "No, why did you do that to me?" But the fact is, the groundhog could have gone any direction, 360 degrees, and he came right to me. He knew exactly what was going on, what exactly had happened to him, and he came to tell me about it. And so this sort of bond between the hunter and the hunted that Europeans tend to scoff at, for Indigenous folks who live that way, I think is a very real thing. And without straying too far, one of the things I learned when I was doing some research, taking a course in Indigenous history at Queen's, was I learned about this grove of aspen in, I think, Colorado, in the mountains in Colorado. That's about 250 or 300 acres. And it's all one organism. It's the UNESCO has declared this the largest living organism on Earth. It's one aspen originally that has sent up all these shoots that are sort of clones. Anyway, I thought to myself immediately, I thought, now what stories would that have to tell? Some people estimate it as much as 40,000 years old. And some people say it could be 1,000,000 years old. And so I said to myself, now suppose you could talk to that organism. And we know trees communicate with each other. And so there's a whole world there that we're on the verge of losing, I think. And I'm not saying that, you know, this is something that every Indigenous person is clued in about, but they're a lot closer to it than we are. And the deeper you go into, I think, their culture, I think the more you do understand that they know stuff that we don't know or we've forgotten, and the stuff that's important, that's going to be important today. It's sort of continuation of my rant, isn't it?
No, well, this is great. So maybe just one more thing, and that is the typical, stereotypical things that you hear about Indigenous people, like they're all drunks, or, you know, they're all corrupt, or, you know, if you can just talk to a few of those and argue against how that doesn't really make sense.
Oh, for sure. I think it's undeniable. They didn't have alcoholic beverages here. They had not developed. They didn't ferment things the way we did it from a very early time. They say barley's about the oldest grain that we know, and I don't think there was any barley here in North America. But I think 8 or 9,000 years ago, they discovered cultivated barley in the Middle East, but they don't know whether it was first used to make bread or beer. The archaeologists can't tell. So that's a very old part of European culture, but it's not a part of the culture here. And not that they didn't have hallucinogens and other, you know, mind-altering substances and practices and disciplines. But you know, over the years, alcoholism kills people. And my own theory, to some extent, is that the white folks who were susceptible to that addiction, and I count myself among those. I've been sober now for 6 or 8 months since last summer, August 8th. When an incident happened that I wasn't proud of, and I decided I'd better stop drinking. So this is not confined at all to Indigenous folks, but they didn't have the gene that the Europeans, I think, have evolved in many ways to resist it. So they were vulnerable to it, and their culture is a dream-driven culture in many ways. The dreams in Indigenous culture are as real as walking through the forest today. So alcoholism or alcohol tends to, you know, go into that realm very, very quickly. But in fact, you know, everybody drank in those days. The Europeans drank. You know, they had small beer for breakfast because they didn't trust the water, and they drank beer all day. And the idea that the Indigenous folks, you know, are just drunkards is, we know today that it's a disease and an addiction. And so to blame them for an addiction that they didn't know they had is like blaming you for getting cancer. You know, it's bizarre. It's insane. And there are, you know, any other number of destructive tropes that they're lazy. Well, you know, they're just sitting on reservations collecting all our money. And when you actually count the money, it's about 1/3 what we get spent on us. When you count all the taxes that get spent on us, well, they don't pay any taxes. No, because they traded their land, all of their land, the 3 million square miles of Canada, they traded away for tax-free status. So they've earned that. You know, how can you begrudge them that when our whole country is built on the land that they donated essentially to us? So that just makes me cross, that argument. And the idea that they're lazy, well, the Indian Act forced them onto the reserves. They didn't want to go onto reserves. You know, there was a long period in the early 1800s in Ontario, up until about 1830 or 35, as I recall, where they didn't begin creating reserves, and the southern Ojibwe and the Mohawks and everybody else just lived where they wanted to live. And they were gradually forced off where they wanted to live by white settlement through some coercion or more or less coercive way. But there were no reserves, and it was only, with the creation of the Indian Act that we decided that this is an Indigenous person and this is not. That's our definition, not theirs. And then we created the reserves, and we said you have to live on the reserves, and you can't buy and sell your own land, and there were all these other conditions, and so we created that society, and they're quite aware of Idle No More is their creation, not ours, and so these are racist tropes to me that are so completely unfair. They just image the world that we forced them into, and that we justify because we won. And the history of the Indian Act itself is worth looking into, in terms of forcing people who were very independent-minded. And I think the Americans think that they're, individual liberty-minded more than any other people on earth. But they never looked at Indigenous culture. It's the most independent, individual independent culture that you can think of. And, that's one thing that the Europeans could never get used to when they were trying to make them allies and fight their battles for them and with them. They all said, well, they're completely undisciplined, They go home when they want to, and they fight when they want to. And, well, yeah, because that's the way they ran their culture. There were no, warrior chiefs led from the front, not the back. And they led by persuasion. There was no way that a warrior chief, for instance, like Joseph Brant in the American Revolution, could order any warriors to march with him. He had to persuade them. And persuasion is the basis of most of their culture in that sense. So none of this top-down hierarchy where the general says go and die and you go and die. There was none of that. If you wanted to follow and go and die, then that was your choice. And when you got fed up with it, you went home. It was just, this culture clash was so profound from beginning to end that we forgot that we're just human beings on either side of that cultural division, and began, once Europeans were in enough numbers here, and we began to treat them like less than human beings, because we could. But we couldn't for the first 150 years. We didn't have the power to, and we knew it. And so we were humble and treated them, even though in the back of our minds, our little white minds in the back there, we said, well, we'll get them in the end. We're going to get this land in the end. And I'm being cynical now, but some of the historical documents, even around the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and later British proclamations, hints very strongly that they all thought assimilation was the only way to go right from the start, but they could not impose it until the hordes of Europeans arrived here that enabled them to impose it. And I think it's only now, as a modern society, the last residential school closed in '96. It's only now, as you could even say postmodern society, that we're beginning to understand it from their point of view. And we've got a huge distance to go. But I think it's important that we do go. They know all about us, mostly the bad things about us, which we refuse mostly to acknowledge. So the reconciliation is a real thing, and my Whenever anybody says, well, what do they want? And I said, well, you go and read the Truth and Reconciliation Report. There's 94 things they want. Read them and do them. That's it. It's very simple. And then let's talk some more about what they want. I know I get a little intolerant at dinner sometimes about such conversations. I have a friend who's a successful corporate lawyer, and we have dinner together as families. I remember one dinner he said, well, I think we've got to do away with all of this race-based legislation, like the Indian Act and all that stuff. And I looked at him, I kind of chuckled, and I said, well, you know, all of the million or so of indigenous folks would agree with you, just backdate it 300 years. And then we can talk. And the conversation kind of ended then. But it's, you know, we have to go back through our own history 300 years to figure out, in a sense, what our relationship needs to be. It needs to go back to being equal. And it's unfortunate we have to go back so far to get an inspiration about what lies ahead. But yeah, up until, say, the end of the War of 1812, or even later, the fur trade began to die about 1820, and the fur trade is one of the best examples of trading equal to equal. Although, you know, the traders tried to get as much as they could for as little as they, you know, could. That's kind of human nature. So did the indigenous folks try to get as many, whatever, blankets or muskets or copper kettles, if you will, as they could for the minimum number of pelts. So that's just normal bargaining. But that's an equal to equal relationship. What has happened since is not. And I have the utmost respect for modern indigenous people who have still the patience to work their way through with us to solve some of these things. And, you know, I think there are positive signs. You know, some of the modern land treaties, some in BC and I think up north, and the creation of Nunavut, I think, is a wonderful symbolic gesture, if nothing else. But I think we are learning, and that gives me hope about the future for Canada, for sure, that we are coming around to understand that, you know, and you know, the abuse of power is a thing that human beings do, whether it's white settlers to indigenous folks or men to women, is something that is very hard to learn. And so listening to women about abuse of power and communicating the situation that they are faced on a daily basis to a society that has been, you know, run by men and not listening, is analogous to what is going on with indigenous cultures and Western European cultures that we have now. I think things are changing ever so slowly, but they are, I think, drop by drop. But it's 2 steps forward and 1 back quite often. And it's discouraging, but I think we can't stop pushing forward to make it better. That's our job, to me, as Canadians. It's the coat of arms of Canada, I think in the middle 70s, added, you know, it's the original motto is Mary Usquad, Mary Sea to Sea, but in, I think, the 70s, they added, when the Order of Canada was created, they added another motto in there, which is in Latin, which says they desire a better country. And I think that is what makes Canada a wonderful place to live and to grow in and to help make this happen. So I'm optimistic if the goodwill on both sides continues. And I know enough Indigenous people. I grew up with some seasonal. My dad had a cottage up near Algonquin Park, and so I became acquainted with the Mohawk family, an Offres Mohawk family up there as a kid. And we got to be good friends. And one of them, Charlie, there's an annual canoe race. It's about a 10-mile canoe race up the Magnetawan River from the little town of Kearney to where our cottage was on Sand Lake. And I had the privilege of being the bow paddler for Charlie Franklin, who was Mohawk, who tolerated me from the stern. We didn't win, but we had a few good laughs on the way. And so I think the potential is there for us to just see each other as human beings and begin to solve things. But the settlers in us have to acknowledge what we did before we can, as part of moving on, I should say, For sure, it's a burden.
Okay, I can't think of anything more to ask you. I mean, I love your rambles. I mean, it's totally wonderful. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad you think so. People find it tiresome.
I don't know
Sometimes
why,
I start preaching about it, and people say,
but
"Oh,
it
yeah,
has to be.
whatever."
It's important to preach.
Well, I think these things are important, and each of us has a tiny role to play. It doesn't matter how big it is, but every little step along the way helps. Every one, and I'm a firm believer in that. And just one little act of kindness goes a long, long way. One little word of kindness, of understanding, I think goes a very long way. And that's those few words of kindness and understanding that the Indigenous folks experienced over the last 200 years are what allowed us to get here in a more or less peaceful dialogue today. And I can tell you there were very few, very far between. But there were some well-meaning white folks who tried hard from time to time to ease the yoke, essentially, of slavery that we put on these people. It's not much different than than the African slaves that, and yes, for sure, they were sold to us by other Africans and by Arabs and all sorts of other people. It wasn't just white folks who invented slavery at all. But we kind of industrialized it. And the difference between just sort of, what could you say, incidental or accidental acts of racism and organized government policy is a huge difference. And ours was organized government policy. And that we have to atone for, I think.
Did you know that in Iceland, Moroccans came and got slaves from Iceland?
It wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. No, it was a worldwide thing.
Yeah.
People are
usually, oh my God, it's always white people taking.
Oh no.
It's just everybody taking slaves from everybody.
Well, that's very true, and I think in the in North America we just got. Not only did we get sort of better at it. In a sense, we industrialized it. But it also became the fundamental, one of the fundamental pillars of capitalism. And the Industrial Revolution was getting cheap cotton to Britain. And first they destroyed the hand weavers of India who were selling their cotton to Britain. When they discovered, mechanical looms and steam-driven cloth manufacturing, they stopped buying Indian cotton, and those guys just starved. They just starved to death. There's a great quote in the 1870s, I guess, or 60s, by one of the governors of India, British governors of India, who said, "The bones of the cotton weavers litter the plains of India." And that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that's what drove the slave trade to produce cotton. And without cotton, without mass-produced, slave-produced cotton, the Industrial Revolution would never have occurred. And capitalism we would not see modern capitalism the way it is today. All of that was built on slave trade. And so, yes, everybody did it. We just did it better, so to speak. And coincidentally, coinciding with the Industrial Revolution in the West made it, an industrial product itself, which was a different qualitatively thing than Moroccans buying slaves in Iceland and selling them to Moroccans to have in their palaces or use them on farms or whatever. This was mass production slavery that we created. And so I think it is different. It's a different order of magnitude. Let me put it that way. And our whole society is built on it. And land theft. Capitalism is built on slavery and land theft. I sound like a commie, I know, and I'm not a capitalist because I don't have enough capital. And it has made all of us wealthy. But we need to acknowledge that it's built on the bones of slaves and indigenous peoples who we stole a whole continent, a rich continent. And that plus slavery allowed us to dominate the world. Without those two things, Britain would never have become a world power. Capitalism would be just another way of doing things, not the thing that dominates the world today. And I wish the capital C capitalists would remember that once in a while and be humbled, because we've nearly gone off the cliff a couple of times with the capitalist world and the banking industry collapsing and all of that stuff. There's a huge abyss facing us if we don't get a little humble and start reforming ourselves, reforming government, reforming industry and that sort of thing. So I'm a reformer. I would say I'm a reformer. I'm not a Marxist. Although I am trouble for some people.
Okay, well, thank you so much. A wealth of,
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Mary, I loved working with you. I was very sorry I just couldn't do any more and left the burden to you. But
I was just so grateful to Michelle because, that worked out really, really well.
yeah.
The two of us just were, totally,